is just barely above custodial staff. And when the laboratory was located at Hendon Police College in suburban London, it was then under the direction of H.S. Holden. She received her degree in biology in 1953, which should have made her eligible for scientific officer or court-going officer, but she was denied advancement to that rank by the then director, L.C. Nichols, because it was, in the words of P.D. James, an unsuitable job for a woman, unquote. She stayed on at the Met Police, overcame those obstacles, and ended up leaving the Met Police in March 1976 to become deputy director of the CRE at Aldermaston. She became director of the Home Office Forensic Laboratory at Aldermaston in 1978, and then quickly transferred to become the director of the Home Office Lab at Chepstow in 1979. Not to be outdone at that point, she was appointed controller of the entire Forensic Science Service in 1982, where she remained until her retirement in 1988. She wasn't through, of course, with contributing to the forensic sciences. She's continued to be very active since then, and served as the president of the Forensic Science Society in 1991 to 1993. And it is indeed a privilege and an honor to introduce her here today to tell you about this remarkable voyage. And I'll ask Ms. Pereira to come forward to speak about women and the development of forensic science.
Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, I only hope I can live up to the build-up that I've just been given. But before I start to talk, I would like to say how very honoured I am to have been asked to give this prodigious lecture. Your association and the Forensic Science Society have profited mutually from close association over, I suppose, about 30 years. And I sincerely hope that this will continue long into the future. We particularly hope that we shall have the privilege of a return visit from the CAC to England in the not too distant future. I'm sure that you will realise that how much we value our association with you. You realise that a very large contingent of English people from the Society have come across today. And I don't think it's just because of the weather. I know that we're often described as two nations divided by a common language. So if I do use any terms, I don't suppose I will, not to this educated audience, but if I do use any terms which you don't understand, just feel free to interject. When John DeHaan approached me nearly a year ago with the invitation to speak on the subject of women in forensic science, my first reaction was, well, what difference does gender make? In this day and age, the involvement of women is certainly not a rarity, I'm pleased to say. However, on reflection, I recognise that even in these enlightened times in which we live, and regardless of the obvious physical differences, women face problems not encountered by their male counterparts, and I shall come to some of these later on. They can also provide insights into forensic problems which are different from those of their male counterparts. In the United Kingdom, there are many women who have established highly creditable reputations in this subject. And this has been the situation for at least 20 years. I know that this is also true of the USA, but I suspect that they have achieved rather more prominence in your country. One only has to consider the number of women presidents, your own association. People like your own current president, Mary Gibbons, and Dorothy Northey, Jan Baczynski, And the American Academy of Forensic Sciences has also had its share of women presidents, including June Jones, Maureen Owens, and Marina Stajic. I hope I've pronounced that one right. I regret that there are far fewer names to recount in our own forensic associations in the UK. I am proud to be the immediate past president of the Forensic Science Society, and I'm sure that although I happen to have been the first woman elected to the presidency, it will be not long before I am the only one. We also have another forensic association in the UK called the British Academy of Forensic Sciences. That has known 2 women presidents, Barbara Dodd and myself. I have to apologise for the lack of detailed knowledge of the situation of women of the USA, but I think it might be of interest to look at the progress of women in forensic science in the UK. The history is interwoven with my own career, and I hope that it will be not regarded as too much of an ego trip if I give a brief synopsis of how I came to be here today. I know that John DeHaan has already mentioned 1 or 2 bits and pieces, but there's quite a lot more to it than that. First of all, how did I come into forensic science in the first case? Well, when I was at school, I wanted to enter the medical profession and specialised in science subjects in my last 2 years. I was competing for a place at medical school just after World War II. At that time, there was a tremendous prejudice against women entering the medical profession. There were very few places allotted to women, in addition to which 90% of all university entrants in the UK at that time were ex-service people. So my chances were slim indeed. Perhaps had I been an outstanding candidate or had a close relation in the profession, I might have been lucky. However, I didn't even secure a university place at all, having missed the boat on the science side because of applying for medicine. And I therefore decided I'd better get a job. I had 2 jobs offered me. One was as a medical scientific trainee, a medical assistant trainee in a hospital, and the other was a scientific assistant at the Metropolitan Police Laboratory. The only reason I chose the latter was because the pay was marginally better, but it was meagre indeed, unbelievable in today's terms, regardless of the difference, the great inflation and so on. I was assigned to the biology laboratory, and it had been decided by the management that it wouldn't be right for a young lady to get involved in casework because most of the cases were of a sexual nature and it would be really too embarrassing for all concerned. So, as a result, my first job was to prepare standard collections for the laboratory. I spent many boring days mounting up samples of hair and fibres, and later a rather more challenging job preparing sections of timbers to help in the identification of wood fragments. This probably sounds a bit strange today, but the identification of wood fragments in those days was very important because there was a very primitive form of fireproofing in safes to prevent fires in stored materials in safes. So the cladding between the 2 layers of the safe, the ballast, was composed of sawdust, which was swept up from cabinet makers' floors or timber merchants' yards or whatever, mixed with alum crystals. And the idea was that the water of crystallization in the alum would be released if there was a rise in the temperature, which would surround the contents of the safe in a layer of soggy sawdust and thus protect them. Sounds unbelievable today, doesn't it? But that was quite an interesting job, actually. I didn't mention that when I joined the laboratory, there were only 7 scientists. I was the 7th. I was the only woman. Even the typist was a man. The only other woman in the building was the cleaning lady. There was no ladies' lavatory. She and I had to go to another building, quite somewhere away, taking our umbrellas when it rained. Actually, this turned out to be quite an advantage to me, because it's given me a certain degree of self-discipline, which has been of value throughout my life. I even managed 2 journeys from Bermuda to Britain without leaving my aircraft seat. Conditions today couldn't be more different. At the Met Lab now, there is a scientific staff of 230, of whom about 90 are women. In recent years, there's been a significantly higher recruitment of women than men. Long may it continue, although it would be pretty boring if it turned out to be all women, wouldn't it? In the Home Office, there are 593 staff in all, 272 of whom are women. To go back to my career, having spent this early period preparing all these standard collections, the workload began to build up, and somebody took the daring step of involving me in casework. Now, I thought I knew the facts of life. After all, I was 18 years old, and my mother had told me, and I'd done biology at school, but I did soon discover that there were some practices that I hadn't even imagined could exist. I leave you to guess what they are. And as a result of my introduction to casework, I learnt to search clothing, examine hairs and fibres, do blood tests, precipitin tests, grouping, ABO grouping. We had to have a stain about the size of a dime in those days to just do ABO grouping. And you know how much information came from that. To continue with my own career, the prospects of entering medical school were very bleak. They continued to be bleak. So I decided that, as John said, I'd better get a degree, because it would be a real dog's body life if I were to continue as a scientific assistant. So I went to evening classes, 4 evenings a week, arriving back at my home at 20 minutes to 11 at night, and I washed my hair on the night off. In 1953, I managed to get a good degree, and I thought, rapture, oh joy, I'm now qualified to be what is known as a reporting officer, i.e. having my own cases and not having to work for other people. But my joy was very short-lived. The director explained to me that this was quite an unsuitable job for a woman, that I would not be able to stand up to the rigours of cross-examination. I would probably burst into tears when the going got rough. And, would you believe this, he even said, don't forget, you've got to go through the menopause. I was all of 25 at the time. Not surprisingly, I was a bit indignant. Highly indignant, in fact. But I had been promoted. I'd been promoted to a technical grade, for which I hadn't even reached the minimum age. And this was a kind of bribe, really, to keep me in the lab. So I then started looking around for other jobs. I would probably have left forensic science altogether if it hadn't been for that. But I just couldn't get another job that I fancied at the same sort of salary. So I said, well, okay, I'll stay. And I did. I continued being involved with the most demanding cases in the laboratory, working mainly as the director's assistant. And I also, at that stage, started some interesting little projects in serology. But nevertheless, I still continued a long-term warfare about this discrimination. The end to this discrimination came very suddenly and quite unexpectedly. We had a special evening at the laboratory, an open evening for members of the Medico-Legal Society. This is a society which meets in London, I don't know quite how often, perhaps once a month, and somebody gives a learned paper, usually either a medic or a lawyer, occasionally a scientist. Anyway, we had this open evening for these people, and each of the staff had to prepare some little presentation. We had all sorts of demonstrations, and the people walked round and asked questions and so on. And it included a large number of criminal lawyers. And I got tackled by one who was particularly feared by the members of the staff, and he gave me a really rough time, asking me lots of awkward questions and so on. And I thought I dealt with him all right. Anyway, apparently I did, because little did I know that the director was listening outside the door, probably worried still. And within 2 or 3 days, I was allocated my first case. So that fight was over at last. Of course, I did realise that I held quite a responsibility for other women, because if I made a mess of this, it would probably set back the chances of other women becoming expert witnesses in the UK for some years to come. Fortunately, everything went well, and I was also obviously very keen to develop my own career, and I didn't look back as an expert witness, and lots of other women eventually joined me. I'd had my odd problems. I remember once going to a court where the witness box was approached by some very steep steps, and at that time long, slim-line skirts were the fashion, and they didn't have the split up the back or wherever as they do today. And I found I had to hoist my skirt over my knees to get up into the witness box, which was a little embarrassing, but the judge didn't comment, I'm glad to say. Now, I've lost my place, you have to excuse me. It's now absolutely unbelievable to recall the attitudes that were pertained at that day. For example, the director insisted that I was not properly dressed for court unless I was wearing a hat. Actually, we kind of had a hat club in the Met Lab with 1 or 2 women who used to borrow each other's hats when we went to court. But this was his attitude. He was getting on in years. He was nearly as old as I am now, actually. And he went to court formally dressed in a black coat and striped trousers. And he was absolutely horrified when one of my women colleagues actually had to attend court in an advanced state of pregnancy. This conservative attitude was not limited to the director. After I had given evidence in a case of buggery, do you all know what that is? My female colleagues in Michigan asked me what it was. And they seemed, but there's no problem in this forensic audience, I'm sure. Anyway, after I'd given evidence in this case of buggery, the judge complained to the director that he had never experienced such an embarrassing incident in his court. And would the director please see that it never happened again? Later, I discovered the circumstances of this case. It appears that the judge was too embarrassed to ask me questions because he didn't give me credit as a qualified biologist to know the mechanisms of male sexual activity. Or if he did give me credit for it, he just didn't have the courage to ask me. But the circumstances of this case were that a policeman saw two men behaving suspiciously in a dark alleyway late at night. And this was before the time when we had an act which permitted consenting adults in private to perform homosexual acts. And this case was brought to court. And the active man pleaded not guilty, and the passive man pleaded guilty. And this, of course, was a bit difficult for the active man, but he came up with the story that the other man had approached him in this alleyway with his trousers down, and hence the act. Well, you can lead a horse to water. In the event, this complaint turned out to be very much to my advantage, because in those days we used to receive a very large number of these very boring male indecency cases. Police officers were most enthusiastic about bringing in people for this abominable crime. And I know there was one port where the police officers used to go around the public lavatories, or restrooms as you call them, looking under the doors of the closets to make sure there was only one pair of feet in each closet. So that kind of work was extremely boring, and I didn't have to do anything more about it. Instead, I just dealt with homicides and serious rapes and things of that nature, which was much more interesting. I was soon joined in the biology division at the Met Lab by Sheila O'Sullivan, now Keating. I'm sure there are 1 or 2 people here who know her. She was in court and a very pompous old counsel, that's attorney to you, asked her, he obviously wanted to ask her some questions of a very personal nature about sex. And he said, "Tell me, is it Miss or Mrs. O'Sullivan?" To which Sheila replied, "Doctor, please." He didn't ask any more questions. Sheila is now, she's had a very successful career as an expert witness and is now in charge of training at the Met Lab. I left the Met Lab in 1976 on appointment as Deputy Director at CRE, as John DeHaan has mentioned, and then I had these various other directorships, which he's also mentioned. I'd just like to tell you a little bit about Chepstow, because that was really quite a challenging period of my career. The Chepstow Lab is just inside Wales, and it deals with the whole of the southwestern peninsula of England and South and Mid Wales. If anybody can remember what England looks like, you know, and Wales is a kind of bit that goes out like that. Well, that's what we dealt with, and it involved uniting 2 previous laboratories, one at Cardiff in Wales and the other at Bristol in the southwest, and all the police officers on both sides of the Bristol Channel, known on each side as across the water, were absolutely against this amalgamation. So it was quite a challenge getting the staff integrated, which wasn't difficult, and convincing the police officers that we were going to do a good job. And it took off very quickly. Everything settled down well, staff integrated well, and in no time at all the police were quite happy, and they discovered that it wasn't that difficult getting across the water. There was one police officer who reckoned that it was nearer for him to take his casework to Dublin than it was to bring it to my laboratory. But when he did eventually decide to come and visit me, he arrived an hour and a quarter early because he had underestimated, or rather overestimated, how long it was going to take him. In 1982, I became controller of the Home Office, which required a move back to London. This was quite an advantage in a way, because I was able to take up permanent residence with my long-suffering husband. We no longer had the fear that we might pass each other on the motorway, or the freeway as you call it, at the weekends, one going east and one going west. The only mistake we did have was once when I had a meeting in London on a Friday, and I thought, oh, that's nice, I'm going to be able to go home on a Thursday. And when I arrived, instead of finding a husband waiting for me with delight, he was sitting in front of the television eating his dinner. Fortunately, it was only his dinner he had on his knee and not a glamorous blonde. As controller, I was responsible for 6 regional laboratories and CRE. It was a very demanding job and very satisfying in many ways. But I have to confess that I missed the close association with casework and the camaraderie of the laboratories. I spent 5.5 years in that post and retired in 1988. Well, that's got the personal history out of the way, except one other thing I would like to mention which I had to suffer, and that was press coverage. The inaccuracy and the hyperbole was so irritating. Following involvement in a high-profile homicide, I got dubbed Miss Murder, a title which stuck for many years. I was once reported to have burst into tears when meeting a murder victim's husband, and I was even credited by one very inventive journalist of having discovered that blood contained proteins and enzymes. When I was described as a well-groomed woman instead of an attractive brunette or a brilliant young scientist, I realised I was really over the hill. There was one rather startling headline when I became controller. At least it wasn't startling to me, but it was very startling to the Home Secretary. That's the Secretary of State for the Home Office, who's responsible for the police, the fire service, all the internal matters of the state. And this headline said, "Maggie loves a drop of blood." Now, he didn't think it was this Maggie. He thought it was Margaret Thatcher. And he was very concerned, but very relieved when he read the article. I even made it into the Italian press, an Italian pathologist that I'd worked with some years ago sent me a cutting about La Donna, Sherlock Holmes nella donna, Sherlock Holmes in a skirt. So I think the newspapers used a lot of these things to fill up when they hadn't got anything else to say. Now I've really got the personal history out of the way, and I can talk about some of the other initiatives of women in forensic science. These aren't in chronological order, and they're certainly not listed in any form of priority or significance. Firstly, I'd like to pay tribute to Barbara Dodd. Some of you who are very old might have heard of her. She was based at the London Hospital Medical College, and much of her work was related to paternity testing, but she was also employed by the defence on bloodstain work. And I found it very valuable discussing serological problems with her because she was looking at it from another point of view. And there may be some of you in the audience also who have heard of Shirley Butcher. Shirley Butcher was a tough Australian woman. She was in the chemistry division at the Met Lab, having previously worked in the government chemist's laboratory in Malaya. She was an absolute perfectionist and a force to be reckoned with. No one went out of their way to cross swords with Shirley. She saw the need for specialisation in arson investigation, a male preserve if ever there was one. And so she set up the Met Lab's Fire Investigation Unit. Since her retirement, despite her initiative and success, it's only very recently that another woman has joined this unit. By the end of the 70s, there were many women in the Met Lab, including some very bright and well-qualified individuals. A number of initiatives were set up by some of them. For example, we had been seriously deficient in hard facts relating to the survival of seminal constituents in the human vagina. Since the pill had become the predominant method of contraception, it was possible to undertake a program to investigate this subject. Volunteer donors within the laboratory provided vaginal swabs and gave precise details of time intervals after sexual activity. Samples were also provided by some women who were not sexually active. Each donor had a number known only to Elizabeth Wilson. It was Elizabeth Wilson and Ann Davis who set up this initiative. Elizabeth must have had a unique knowledge of the sexual activities of her colleagues, but fortunately she was a woman of great discretion and there was never any kind of leak. It was really, this research could not have been done without women in the lab. It really couldn't. In the ladies' restroom there was a notice. There was a little drawing of a swab stick with a reef knot in the shaft of this stick, and it said, "Have you provided your swabs today?" I don't know. There's nobody from the Met Lab here, so it is great. I recall Ann Davis reading a paper on this topic at the IAPS meeting in Edinburgh in 1970. She was very pregnant at the time, and I couldn't help musing that some of the delegates might be thinking that her condition was the direct result of her research. An elderly professor from continental Europe was absolutely shocked by this presentation. To complete this story of feminine activity and fitting in with other feminine activities, Elizabeth Wilson wrote up this project for publication while she was on maternity leave, thus making good use of her time in more senses than one. Ann Davis later set up a sexual assault index in the Met Lab, and this has become a highly valued source of intelligence for police in London and also for the National Intelligence Bureau. As well as the obvious data relating to blood and semen groups, including DNA and other information of a scientific nature, there are records about details such as involvement in violence or breaking into buildings. It has been found that about 90% of rapists have a mixed criminal career. Details of individual cases can give a lead as to likely offenders. One of the obvious aims of the index is to identify series cases. Ann's work in developing the index eventually led her into the field of offender profiling, and she is currently a member of a specialist team at the Home Office, which is developing this form of expertise in the UK following the FBI initiative. Anne Preston is yet another Met Lab woman who has shown much initiative. Those of you who are biologists may be familiar with the Metropolitan Police Laboratory Methods Manual, which was published in 1987. Anne did a splendid editorial job on this while she was pregnant. This is another example of a woman combining the roles of forensic scientist and raising a family. She has made a special study of legal matters in relation to forensic science and is about to spend a period of attachment to the Treasury Council. This department handles all the major criminal cases in England and Wales. Frances Lewington is another Met Lab woman who has become deeply involved with another aspect of forensic work. She set out initially to provide instruction to forensic medical examiners about the work of the laboratory and the way in which samples should be taken from victims for subsequent laboratory examination. She quickly established a rapport with this group throughout the country and was a regular lecturer at their conferences. As a result of this association, Frances who's a very caring person, became concerned about the conditions under which victims of rape and other sexual assaults were examined and took over the organisation of facilities in the London area. In a collaborative exercise with certain medical examiners, well-equipped examination rooms were set up, and every consideration was given to the comfort of victims. This included ensuring that the examination rooms were sensitively placed. For example, that the victims didn't have to walk through the charge room in order to face their medical examination. There were also facilities provided so that the victims could take care of their hygiene after the examination. And they're also provided with comfortable tracksuits because they, after all, need something to change into once their clothing has been taken away for laboratory examination. I'm sure they also feel much better not having those particular clothes on anymore. Pam Hamer is a chemist in the Met Lab. Quite early in her career, she volunteered for a 2-year attachment to the Northern Ireland Forensic Science Laboratory at a time when that lab was under great pressure due to the escalation of terrorism. After a period back in London, she took time out and did a higher degree, and then for another period she worked for the firm Foster and Freeman, who developed the refractive index, the glass refractive index measurement equipment, GRIM. This instrument has been a great boon, as I'm sure any of you who look at glass will know, in the comparison of the refractive index of glass fragments. 2 women formerly of the Home Office Forensic Science Service have set up their own firms of independent forensic scientists. In both cases, they were later joined by their husbands, also forensic scientists. The firm Forensic Access, which was set up by Angela Gallup, is particularly successful. Her firm has enlarged and can now cover most aspects of forensic science. Angela is exceptionally articulate and is often consulted by the media on forensic matters. She takes on radio and television interviews in her stride like a professional broadcaster, and she's also very good looking. Although I cannot attempt to refer to every woman who has made her mark in forensic science in the UK, I would like to draw attention to 2 younger women, Sarah Westwood and Cecilia Buffery. Sarah has been successful as a research worker in the field of blood and body fluid typings at CRE and has published a number of papers in prestigious journals. Cecilia was at the Met Lab working on DNA. She is currently involved in work of another kind, raising a family. She plans to take 5 years out, but I'm sure she will continue to make a name for herself when she returns. And of course we've got 2 other women who are well known in forensic science circles in England in this meeting today. We have Lynn Faraday, who's a senior member of the Home Office, and June Guinness, who's a leading light in the DNA field. My successor as controller, although she was called the more glorious title of Director General, is Dr. Janet Thompson. She's also a scientist but doesn't have a forensic background. She's had the enormous responsibility of transforming the Forensic Science Service to agency status, which you were told about yesterday by the Chief Constable. This has meant, instead of direct government funding from public purse, it has become a self-funding organisation selling its services to the police and other agencies. The new conditions have given the service greater flexibility in the work it undertakes, and only time will tell whether this government-driven change to commercialisation and exposure to market forces will be to the long-term benefit of the forensic science in the UK and hence to justice. It certainly, from what I hear, seems to be going very well at the moment. In addition to scientists, women medical examiners, police surgeons, have been around for many years. There was one lady in the London area when I was young called Edith Bruce Wilson. She was known by the police and the Director of Public Prosecutions Department as Three Fingers Edie, because it was a term she used to use when describing the condition of the vagina. I examined the vagina and it would admit 3 fingers, was what she nearly always said when she got in the witness box. But in recent years, very recent years in fact, women have also penetrated into the male-dominated sphere of forensic pathology. We now have 3 Home Office recognised forensic pathologists out of a total of 47 in England and Wales, and I understand that there are 3 or 4 women also operating in Scotland. In another field, Sue Thornwell is head of fingerprint training at the National Training Centre for Scientific Support in Durham. Those of you who were here yesterday will have heard something about that. This I find very amusing because when I was young, all of the fingerprint officers were police officers. They didn't even consider that men who weren't police officers could possibly do this work, and the very idea of a woman being head of the training would make some of them turn in their graves. Also at this meeting there's a number of we've got a lot of women scenes of crime officers in England, and we've got some very keen examples here at this meeting. In preparing this talk, I've also attempted to consider the situation of women in forensic science outside the British mainland, although my information is not as complete as I would have liked it to be. Across the Irish Channel, Stella McCrossan is a chemist and a leading light in the Northern Ireland Forensic Science Laboratory. She has had a major role in establishing the laboratory in its new premises after its predecessor was devastated by an IRA bomb. Stella is a person of great drive and a very active member of our society. Over the border in the Republic of Ireland, Sheila Willis is head of chemistry at the Forensic Science Laboratory in Dublin. She is a powerful personality, both as a scientist and in her relaxation. The last time I met her, she'd just climbed the Matterhorn. Women are well represented in Dublin. Maureen Smith is head of biology, and most of the biologists there are women. There is also a great spirit of cooperation between the forensic scientists on both sides of the Irish border in the island of Ireland. A few years ago, Stella and Sheila were joint conveners of one of our society's very successful meetings. I have been in recent correspondence with Professor Michel Roudelet, who was at one time director of the Interregional Police Forensic Science Laboratory in Paris. She now heads the Institute of Legal Medicine in the University of Paris. She gave up her former post because she couldn't continue with her toxicological career. She's also the French expert on chemical weapons at the United Nations and the chief medical officer of the city of Paris. On being asked whether she had experienced any difficulties as a woman, she said that she had succeeded because she was a fighter and she loved her work. She also expressed a wish that I would be able to promote the cause of equal rights for women scientists in Europe. The lady sounds quite a femme formidable, but I'm told she's a very charming person. Another woman who holds a senior position is Margaret Lawton. She's the director of the Forensic Science Laboratory in New Zealand. There must be many achievements by women in the USA which are not included here, but I'm sure you would not expect me as a Brit to come across here and lecture you about your own country. I do know that you have had a number of women directors of laboratories. Also at this meeting is Helen James from Australia, who's a forensic odontologist. So far, I have confined my remarks to the work of the more senior and highly qualified women working in forensic science. It would be most remiss not to mention that many of the assistants are young women who perform a very important role. I don't have precise figures about how many there are, or the proportion of women assistants in the UK, but I do know that I was lucky enough to have some excellent young women working with me who produced very careful bench work and meticulous notes, and their assistance was absolutely invaluable. I'm sure the situation is much the same today. I can't give a global picture of the relative proportion of women vis-à-vis men working in forensic science and the positions they hold. In the UK, there is now quite a high percentage of women and a good proportion of reporting officers, but not too many women are in senior positions. Of course, there are many reasons for this. Many women give up their careers to raise families or take a long break, which naturally has an adverse effect on the promotion stakes, particularly in subjects in which there are many advances in a relatively short space of time. There are also other problems which are even more specific to forensic science. All science is moving quickly, but in forensic science, and also forensic pathologists, of course, individuals have to be prepared to be called out in the middle of the night to go to scenes of crime, and are constrained by the necessity for court experiences, court appearances, which can be very constrictive. So thus the demands of court are very intrusive on personal life. Of course, the wives of forensic scientists are expected to take these kind of vicissitudes in their stride. In the UK, we've seen a number of forensic marriages, and it has been said that having a spouse who really knows and accepts the demands of the job is a definite plus. Somebody who knows that when one comes back from a scene of a crime at 4 o'clock in the morning, a nice plate of scrambled eggs would just go down very well is ideal. There is still a feeling among some of the women in the UK that there remains an element of sexual discrimination, and that one's chances of reaching a really senior position are reduced. I don't know whether this is true or not. Two of the women I have mentioned in this talk have said quite independently that they think that women have shown more initiative than their male colleagues, and that this is at least partly due to the fact that they consider their career expectations to be more limited. If this is so, one might justifiably conclude that women have given a great deal to forensic science, but they have not yet reached their full potential in terms of seniority. So far, I have considered the position of women in forensic science more or less in isolation. But it would be perhaps useful to consider the enormous progress which has been made in this subject during my career. I find it almost horrifying to look back on the limitations of forensic science in my early years. Of course, all aspects of science have come a long way, but I can't help feeling that in those days, forensic science in the UK, and I suspect elsewhere as well, was something of a poor relation in scientific terms. I made my first visit to the USA in 1964 and managed to include a visit to the FBI lab. I went in expectation of finding a laboratory far in advance, both in equipment and accommodation, compared with our lab in the old Scotland Yard building. Instead, I felt almost as if I had just come home. Although there were differences in the crime pattern, such as the greater use of firearms in the USA, many of the problems were the same. There were even cardboard boxes under the benches containing items for examination, just like in the Met Lab. How very different both labs are today, highly organised and well equipped. One aspect of the work of a forensic scientist in my early days was the wide range of so-called expertise that one was expected to be able to provide. I was happy to cope with blood and body fluids, with identification and comparison of hairs and textile fibres and shoe prints and tool marks, etc. I drew the line at toxicology and other forms of analytical chemistry. One very strange type of examination, which I used to have to do in those days, was theft of coal. It wasn't unusual in those days. Coal was then the principal form of domestic heating in the UK, and furthermore it was rationed. Because of the dire economic situation in the United Kingdom following World War II, many commodities were rationed until 1953. Comparison of coal samples was a ghastly job. It involved digesting samples in pyridine to extract the spores and carrying out differential counts of the various spore types. The process took many days, and I also always felt that we were short of hard evidence of the significance of matching samples. I was glad that I was only involved in this work as an assistant, as I would not have felt competent to testify on this matter. From these early beginnings, which perhaps only people of my vintage have experienced, I know there's one here that remembers it well. Hi, Peter. From these early beginnings, it has been very exciting to witness the development of forensic science, from such rudimentary methods to the present-day state of the art. When I started, as I mentioned earlier, one needed quite a large stain even to get the ABO type. And for those serologists present, I should tell you that we didn't even have anti-H then. So we could, unless we got anti-A and anti-B extracted from the stains, we couldn't have a positive reaction from group O. So the vast majority of stains that we tried to group had negative reactions, either because there wasn't enough blood or because it was group O and the agglutinins had deteriorated. Of course, over the years there have been many additional markers in dried stain work, and it's been very exciting to see this develop, but nothing more exciting than the arrival of DNA on the scene for use in forensic work. I was happy to see this coming into operation just before I retired. I wonder how long it will be before many of the systems on which we have relied for so long will become obsolete. Will typing in such systems as ABO, PGM, haptoglobin, etc. be a thing of the past? I suspect it will. I was very impressed yesterday to see that wonderful example of quality assurance, a transatlantic one on the Waco incident, that the same kind of results using the same systems were coming out on such awful material from both sides of the Atlantic should be a very good argument for forensic scientists to put up when lawyers start arguing about the reliability of DNA. Analysis of blood and urine for alcohol levels, particularly in drink driving cases, has been bread and butter work for forensic scientists for generations. In the UK, although breath testing has been standard for many years, motorists have the option of blood analysis for confirmation if they are over the statutory limit. In days gone by, analysis depended on the measuring of the degree of reduction of an oxidizing agent and involved tedious titrations. What a difference the introduction of gas chromatography has made. It was quite unbelievable in those days. The analysts used to actually pipette the samples by mouth. And quite a lot of them were urine samples. And there were one or two careless individuals that used to have the odd accident. They used to keep some orange juice by for a mouthwash. It just, it doesn't bear thinking about today, does it, really? The difference in the standard in health and safety, knowledge and requirements today compared with then is quite amazing. It's a wonder that I didn't die either from cancer due to the use of benzodine or hepatitis B or various other horrible things when I think of all the exposure that I've given myself. I remember in the late 1960s, there was, the laboratory at that time was situated in Holborn, and there was a lovely cake shop just down the road. And I had the awful job to stop my staff from sitting there typing blood with a piece of beautiful cream cake beside them. Of course, things like that couldn't possibly happen today. I hope. In my early days, there were no comparison microscopes. Can you imagine trying to compare hairs and fibres without a comparison microscope? In the late 1950s, a bridge was developed whereby you could put two simple microscopes together and view hairs or fibres side by side, with this bridge connected, instead of you have one ocular and a prism. But of course it was terribly primitive. The lenses weren't matched, the lighting systems weren't matched, but fortunately it wasn't long before we managed to commission very sophisticated comparison microscopes, complete with UV light sources. And of course we've had all sorts of other developments in the fibre field, like the use of thin layer chromatography, microspectrophotometry, etc. This is just but one example of the way in which modern instrumentation has changed forensic science. Of course you also use, at least in my day anyway, perhaps it's changed now, but infrared was used for differentiation between acrylic fibres, so that the degree of differentiation advanced enormously. What a difference between today and then. What would a toxicology lab be like today if we didn't have GCMS and all the other gadgetry? What would the laboratories be like without scanning electron microscopes, without FTIR, etc.? What would they be like? Can you imagine it? When I was young, it used to be called wet chemistry. The toxicology lab was unbelievable. This famous L.C. Nichols, the man who didn't think that women weren't good enough, he used to have all his toxicological analysis. He used to insist on certain processes being used using ammonium sulfate, so that he could take the guts residues home in order to bring on his roses. He was a very keen horticulturist and showed his roses at various shows, and there were a lot of comments about, oh yes, that rose that won that show was fertilised with Mrs. Christie juice or something like that. There was even one amazing case, and if anybody has seen the old textbook written by Nichols, one can see a photograph of it. We had a case in the laboratory of suspected cantharidin poisoning. A young man was trying to, this of course was supposed to have aphrodisiac qualities, and a young man who worked in a factory which produced some hair product and used cantharidin was trying to secure the affections of a young woman in the department who wasn't in the least interested. So he bought some confection and laced it with cantharidin and gave it to her. She didn't happen to fancy it, so she gave it to her friend, who ate it and died, because cantharidin is extremely toxic. And the equipment of the laboratory was just incapable of detecting this. Now, this thing is that causes blisters. It's extracted from the blistering beetle. And the only way that the extracts could be proved to have cantharidin in them was to do scratch tests on somebody's arm, and a blister was raised. And there is a photograph of that blister in Nick's book. In the Met Lab, in those early days, the instrumentation consisted of a spectrograph, which was used mainly for paint comparisons, a Hartridge spectroscope, which was used for carbon monoxide estimations, and a refractometer for refractive index of glass. There were quite a number of microscopes around, two of which had binocular heads. The rest were the old-fashioned one eye. I'm short-sighted in one eye, which is quite convenient because at my age I don't need to wear specs in order to read. But that's because this eye is like this and the other eye is like that. So I have another thing to thank the Metropolitan Police Laboratory for. It used to be said at one time that if a chemist had a cold, and his most important instrument was his nose, and if he had a cold, he might as well go home. What a difference it is today. They still stay home when they've got colds. Giving testimony in court can perhaps be regarded as the normal end product of forensic scientists' work. In the UK prior to 1968, it was necessary for us to attend court on numerous occasions, giving evidence both at preliminary hearings, that's magistrates' courts, and at trials, Crown courts as we call them. As a result, those of us who are long in the tooth have very much experience of witness box. But of course, we've wasted hours travelling around from court to court. So the situation today is much better in many ways, and one is able to spend much more time in the laboratory. Unfortunately, it does mean that attending court can be much more stressful. In England, as you've probably seen from television, our judges and barristers wear wigs and gowns in the higher courts, and we stand up to testify unless we're infirm. Certainly keeps us on our toes, because we can perhaps be on our feet, although our courts tend to sit for shorter periods than yours do, we can still be on our feet for many hours in a day. I had the experience of giving evidence in the United States court not very long ago, and although there wasn't the fancy dress that we have, I found the court much more comfortable, nice padded seat to sit on instead of standing up all the time, and there was equal dignity. There's been a lot of argument going on in the UK about whether wigs and gowns should continue to be worn. Both of our countries operate on an adversarial system. Of course, our legal systems have a common origin. On the continent of Europe, they have the inquisitorial system. There are arguments for and against both systems. One of my concerns about the adversarial system is that witnesses tend to belong to a team. There's a feeling of belonging to a team, and that the team needs to win. Ideally, witnesses, and particularly professional witnesses, should be totally impartial. But it is these very witnesses who could, and I underline could, have career advancement or pecuniary gain in mind when making statements and giving evidence. Personal vanity is another hazard, and this might be a problem regardless of the judicial system. Now, I don't wish to give an alarmist impression that there is bias of professional witnesses and that it is commonplace. It certainly is not. The great majority of forensic scientists known to me are of the highest integrity and dedicated to impartiality. Within the adversarial system, justice is best served when competent experts are available both to prosecution and defence. In the UK, with certain notable exceptions, the prosecution has a monopoly of really experienced forensic scientists. Fortunately, especially now that agency status has been brought in, reliable experts are more readily available to the defence, but engaging such experts is costly and financial constraints remain a problem. During the latter part of this century, increasingly greater emphasis has been placed on quality assurance in forensic science. I know that much has been done in this respect here in the USA, and we have been very active in the UK as well. I don't propose to go into details about various measures which have been taken, but with the great advances which have been made in forensic applications of modern science, quality assurance is a matter of paramount importance. Greatly enhanced sensitivity demands much more consideration must be given to the possibilities of contamination, and the huge advance of the statistical significance of DNA evidence, for example, means that the burden of responsibility of the scientist is proportionally increased. And this does not only apply to the risks of wrongful conviction. Risk of wrongful exclusion of the guilty may be equally serious. I recall many years ago now the murder of a young woman, and as a result of bloodstain typing, a suspect was excluded. Not long afterwards, the same man was found guilty of murdering 2 young children and confessed to the previous crime while in prison. I think that story is very salutary. Many people outside our profession think we have very glamorous jobs. They have no conception of how difficult, tedious, and sometimes downright revolting the work can be. Neither do they comprehend the responsibilities. However stringent the quality assurance procedures, and however carefully witness statements are checked by senior colleagues, at the end of the day, it is the individual giving evidence who bears the responsibility for all that he or she says. They can be faced with outstandingly skillful advocates asking very cunning questions, and there is no opportunity to seek advice. At a time when salary levels are assessed by the degree of financial responsibility and the amount of personal decision-making, long-term career prospects for forensic scientists in the UK who do not transfer to managerial roles are not particularly good. Can this be right? Whilst agreeing with the need to obtain value for money, in my view it is essential in the interests of justice that high-quality scientists can be attracted to and retained in this important work. I am no longer fully in touch with the present-day situation following the introduction of agency status, and I only hope that prospects either have or will improve since my day. I hope that I can be excused for my reminiscences about the evolution of forensic science and for my digression into fields which affect both women and men. There are certainly factors which have affected this particular woman and many others as well. Thank you.
Because of the rare opportunity offered by Ms. Pereira's presence, if we have a few minutes to entertain questions or comments from anyone. Surely the wide-ranging comments have struck home to some people. It's hard to believe, I guess, that just in the last 30 years that here in the U.S. we've followed the same path from extreme rarity of women in forensic science through very pleasantly mixed audience that we have here today and in all of our meetings. And those of us who've come in the last 5 or 10 years assume that this was a long-standing permanent arrangement. And it's clear that on both sides of the Atlantic that has not been the case. It's been up to the courage and determination of people like Margaret to see it through. Questions or comments? Yes.
I've just been asked whether I took out time to have a family, and if I didn't, did I face any prejudice? Well, first of all, and also, the general prejudice regarding this matter. First of all, I unfortunately didn't marry until I was getting on in life and decided that, well, probably I wouldn't make it anywhere, and it was a bit too late. So I didn't have any children. I think for my own career development, it would not have worked out at my particular time slot in the evolution to have children. But it is very different today. Women do have children and come back and get on with their careers. I'm sure Lynn Pereira won't mind me mentioning, she's talking later, that she has a 14-year-old son, I believe. Hope I'm embarrassed you. Should I have said he was 4? I don't conversations because it can now take 5 years to find out if I have a right to do it. Take some time off, have a family, then hoping to come back and do it.
weighing things and thinking, don't be absurd, you know, you can taste it at the end, it really doesn't matter. I also work for a charity. I've enjoyed being president of the Forensic Science Society. I've been involved in one or two committees about forensic matters, and I've also was engaged by an attorney in San Francisco a couple of years ago, and actually gave evidence in San Jose last March. So I've had a little. It was because it was a question of yesterday's science rather than today's. The case dated back to 1979, so I had reasonable expertise of that period. And the man concerned had read some of my old papers and thought I might be able to help.
Last November, I had the honor of being at the Forensic Science Society AGM and being presented with the first diploma in fire investigation, as well as this beautiful tie. And it's nice to be able to return the favor and present on behalf of the CAC appreciation to Margaret Pereira for a wonderful Founders Lecture, a plaque in honor of the joint meeting, with hopes that we'll be seeing everyone again very soon. And thanks very much for your contribution to our meeting. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, John, ladies and gentlemen. It's been an enormous pleasure to come to this meeting, and I do hope that this won't be the last joint meeting of the CAC and the Forensic Science Society. So I hope to see you all back in England sometime. Thank you all very much. I've been very honoured to be able to see you.